Our next speaker is Jack Woodward, a lawyer who's been working for the Nuchatlaht since 1980 and is currently working on their title claim in the Supreme Court. If you follow Indigenous rights and title law in this country, Jack's is a name that you've probably heard. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jack.
Well, thank you, Torrance, and thank you so much, Archie, for that beautiful talk. And I'm so grateful that everyone here is present to be part of this webinar, because this is although the Nuchatlaht are a tiny nation, what they're doing is of huge importance for the rights of Indigenous people in British Columbia and across Canada. And it's of huge importance to the project of reconciliation, the great Canadian project of reconciliation that's ongoing. And if anyone was ever nervous about that, if anyone ever wondered if reconciliation was a good idea, and they may have just heard what Archie just said, he said the first thing they're going to do when they get their land back is they're going to say, well, how do we work together? Wouldn't it have been great if the Europeans who first took away this land had that attitude? Well, how are we going to work together with these First Nations that we've just taken their land? And here's this amazing spirit of generosity that comes from the Nuchatlaht, that the first thing they're thinking of is once they get their land back, and they will, they say, well, how can we then work together? They are a generous people and a gracious people. And what marks them, and the message out of what Archie just said, is that they are known amongst the Nuchatlaht Nation as the center of hospitality. We would use the word hospitality. What that means is that they host and support and nurture the other tribes as a kind of a homeland within the homeland. They are the original central tribe of the Nuchatlaht peoples. And if someone ever has a hankering, if a Nuchatlaht person ever has a hankering for the real Nuchalnuth experience, it's Nuchatlaht and their beautiful ancient village at Nuchatlaht on Nootka Island. Nootka Island was the place where the first Europeans who came to North America arrived. Not just the Spanish, who called the whole of their claimed colony that went right from Northern California to Alaska, they called it Nootka. They named it after their original fort that they built on Nootka Island at Friendly Cove. And the British, when Captain Cook came, where did he come? He came straight to Nootka. That's where he came. And he met Chief McQuina, and he met the Nuchatlaht people. And the Spanish and the British and all of those sailing ships that came in the late 1700s, they all met and called them Nuchatlaht people. They were the Nuchatlaht people. And there's an unbroken written history of the Nuchatlaht people from those days to the modern. It's the most extensive, well-documented history of a people who lived on their land in all of Western Canada, in Western United States for that matter, because this was the central place for. It was known because it was the center of the maritime fur trade, but it became a famous place. In the 18th century, people in Europe knew the name Nootka more than they would know any other place on the west coast of North America. And this is the homeland that right now the Nuchatlaht people are fighting for. What they're doing, they're in British Columbia Supreme Court in a lawsuit to get their land back. They're seeking a declaration of Aboriginal title to their ancient historic land, which is the northern part of Nootka Island. And I just want to emphasize that that name Nuchatlaht occurs continuously in every journal of every explorer and missionary and trader and government official from the late 1700s to the modern day. There's no doubt that these are the people who have always been there on that land, living in their home on Nootka Island. And the specific issue that I want to talk about tonight that's of importance, and it's a political issue, and something that all of you might want to take a position on and be involved in, is that in this court case that the Nuchatlaht are bringing to get their land back, the government of British Columbia is a defendant, and they're entitled to file a statement of defense. And in their statement of defense, they say, they plead as a formal pleading that the court has to be satisfied that the Nuchatlaht did not abandon their land. So they put abandonment squarely at issue, the question of whether or not the Nuchatlaht abandoned their land. And that's a real troublesome pleading, because when you think about it, abandonment, what if you if you take a trip to Mexico, have you abandoned your house? How do you prove that negative? How do you disprove the negative? How do you prove that you are continuously in occupation? And we say that that's oppressive of the province of British Columbia, and I'm going to show you why it's not just oppressive, it's wrong, it's actually illegal um, in my presentation tonight. They didn't abandon their land. Here's what happened to them after the first Europeans came. They had, first of all, they were they had terrible diseases, including smallpox. They had to suffer once the sea otters were gone and the smallpox had come through. Then they were. I'll tell you who abandoned them was all the Europeans abandoned. They were left in a situation of distress and poverty through the whole of the 19th century. The government paid no attention to them. But then when the government did pay attention to them, they had to deal with residential schools, laws from the government of Canada prohibiting their potlatch, the central cultural institution of the people. There were laws that prohibited them from actually performing their dances, which is the way they communicate from generation to generation, their culture. It was illegal, for example. It was actually specifically illegal for them to hire a lawyer. It was very oppressive until 1951. They were not. It was a criminal offense to either be a lawyer or be hired, or to hire a lawyer to fight a land claim. And that was actually enforced. There were actually people that I've spoken to who remember going to jail in Tofino for participating in a potlatch. So anything the government, despite everything that the government did, the governments of Canada and of British Columbia, the Nuchatlaht people stayed there, tenaciously honoring and living on their homeland. It was the opposite of abandonment in practical terms. They stayed there against all odds, through the winter storms, not just that, but through the storm of colonialization that hit them so hard. Now, the land, I just want to talk a little bit about their land. It's dominated by these amazing cedar forests. Huge archaeologists describe them as culturally modified trees, groves of culturally modified trees. And culturally modified trees are living trees, but that have evidence in them of human use. So if you strip bark from a cedar tree, it will form a lobe, it will grow, but it will continue to live. But you can find, but if you look in the tree, you can see that the year that the bark was stripped, the tree continues to thrive, and then the bark can be harvested in a future year, and the tree continues to grow. And these trees can be ancient, and they can be interesting shape of multiple lobes. Not because that's how the tree wants to grow. That's because they are continually harvested generation after generation as a source, not just of bark, but also of planks. So the bark, of course, was used for clothing and mats and hats and ropes and diapers, baskets, nets, the whole foundation of the culture based on the cedar bark. And then, of course, the wood itself, you can actually take a plank out of a cedar tree and the tree will continue to grow. And they use those planks for their magnificent houses. And then sometimes, of course, the trees would be down and they made house posts out of them to hold up those big, giant wooden houses they made. And also for their huge ocean-going canoes, which they used to visit neighboring tribes and to go out into the deep sea and hunt whales. It was an amazing relationship between the people and those cedar forests for hundreds of generations. And when the Europeans came, they were still fully intact, enormous cedar forests, despite all of these generations of intensive use. They really were, Europeans would use the word gardening or farming. These were cedar farms because what they did was they managed to use those trees so intensively, but at the end of the day, the trees are all still there. It's an amazing example of what we might call permaculture, or a permanent sustainable relationship between the people and those cedar forests. One of the most incredible relationships that the world's ever seen, right there on Nootka Island. And sadly, a huge amount of that forest has been cut. Uh, we'll come to that later, but there's some of it is still remaining. Some of those magnificent old growth cedar forests are still there with the evidence of human use right in the tree, right on the bark. It's a magnificent archaeological record of human occupation, uh, unequaled anywhere in the world. It's kind of scandalous when you think about it that we would think it would be appalling if the Greeks went and uh, quarried the Acropolis for marble, and yet what we have done in our culture is we've quarried these cedar archaeological sites for cedar shingles. It's really quite a shocking thing to do to an archaeological site like that. But that's not the main issue that we want to talk about. What I want to talk about is the injustice that's happened to the Nuchatlaht people in this regard. But I also want to mention, of course, that they didn't just take the cedar; they hunted in those forests for deer, and of course, in the forests are the lakes and the rivers that had these incredible runs of salmon. And so the Nuchatlaht people, when Europeans arrived, were wealthy. They lived and owned land that was generating enormous wealth, so they could live in comfort, and they didn't have deprivation of hunger. They were they were in they were wealthy people living in their kingdom, so to speak, living well off their land. The government of British Columbia, in the official pleadings in this case, say that they abandoned all that, and of course, they didn't abandon it. Here's what actually happened. First of all, the government of British Columbia, right off the bat, when as soon as the colony existed, passed a land act declaring that all of the land belonged to the crown. And then they passed a forest act saying that all of the trees on the land were under crown management, those same trees. And then they issued licenses to allot those trees to private companies, so that the trees didn't even belong to the crown anymore. They belonged to private companies who were not just allowed, but were ordered to cut down the trees. And all of the game became the property of the crown. It became necessary for Nuchatlaht people themselves to get a license to hunt the game. It was illegal because part of the Nootka Island was made into a park. It was illegal for Nuchatlaht people to even pick berries or even light a campfire in the park. They didn't abandon their territory. They were forced off their territory. Their land was expropriated without compensation. Their land was stolen from them. That's what happened. It wasn't abandoned. So it's unjust and it's unfair, and it's um, uh, an appalling thing that the government of British Columbia still pleads abandonment about the relationship between the Nuchatlaht people and their land. It's a real insult. And so what I'd like to propose to you tonight, all of you who are here, is that we unite in asking the British Columbia government to live up to a particular promise that it's made.